Can you remember the last time you tried to do something? Let's say it was in the middle of the night, it was very late, way past your bedtime, and you are trying to sleep. And no matter what you did, maybe you were surfing the web, listening to a podcast, maybe you put the phone down, you're just listening to crickets, or maybe the sound of cars passing by, counting sheep. No matter what you did, you just couldn't sleep. You're rolling around in bed, you're wondering what's wrong, you're just trying so hard to sleep, but you just can't. I'm sure we've all been there. And it's rather strange, isn't it? The more we tried to do it, the less likely we actually did it. And that is really, I think, the talk that we should have tonight, specifically about the philosophy of doing. When we think about doing, we think the more willfully we try to exert our efforts, we actually achieve the thing we're trying to do. Yet in philosophy, and especially in philosophy of certain people and really concepts, this is not exactly the case. Starting with really the idea of the law of reverse effort from Aldous Huxley. Now, Aldous Huxley is one of the most renowned British authors of the 20th century. He's actually written and published over 50 books. This is a person that can get things done. And according to him, his secret of doing is not so much in actually doing itself. Rather, according to him, the harder we try to consciously do something, the less likely we will actually succeed. Huxley would coin this philosophy into a term known as the law of reversed effort. According to Huxley, proficiency and the result of proficiency come only to those who have learned the paradoxical art of doing and not doing, of combining relaxation to activity. Now, this sounds very abstract at this point, but to highlight this into a practical example, think back to how you learned how to ride a bike. Now, for those of you who've learned how to ride a bike, and I hope that's everybody, but if not, this is a primer. Initially, when you are encountering this contraption known as a bicycle for the first time, you know there are a lot of things to learn. You know you're supposed to get onto the seat in a certain way, sit in the seat in a certain way, position yourself in a certain way, and know how to operate the bike, how to pedal it at certain speed when you want to accelerate, when you want to decelerate, to operate the gears in a certain way, to operate the brakes. In other words, there are all these instructions that you have to willfully learn. But of course, as you learn how to ride the bike, you can't be willfully thinking about every single step I've just mentioned. Imagine actually doing that, trying to go through every single step willfully, consciously. It is very likely that if you're trying to ride that bike and you're willfully thinking about it every second, every moment, you're very likely, and I hope not, but very likely encounter some accident. Because a big part of it is actually letting yourself go as you're riding, as you learn to ride it, to actually embrace intuition, this instinctive feeling of actually being on the bike and just riding it as it is without willfully trying to ride it. And this is exactly Huxley's law of reversed effort. To ride the bike to the most proficient level actually involves an overall sense of effortless action. In other words, actually not doing. And indeed, we can imagine many moments in life when sometimes when we are actually performing at our best, when we're not consciously trying to perform at our best, when we actually give in to the moment and go with the flow, as they say. Now, the law of reverse effort has deeper roots that are quite interesting from a philosophical standpoint, specifically if we link it to Eastern philosophy, specifically Chinese thought. Now, to give you a contrast of views, for the majority of Western thought and Western philosophy, but really Western culture and literature, tracing all the way back to the Greeks, for example, great pieces like Homer's The Odyssey, an epic about Odysseus, we are constantly told these stories of these great heroes who are willfully trying to conquer the adversity and achieve that greatness through these willful action. They set out on a boat somewhere, they're fighting all these monsters, these enemies, and they're doing very hard to perhaps save that damsel in distress. And for much of Western thought, which very much is much of global thought today, it's been very rooted in this idea that you have to do a lot and exert all this effort to actually achieve greatness and achieve the thing that you want to achieve. Yet, according to the philosophies of Daoism, specifically the famous text of Daoism, Dao De Jing, there's a concept known as Wu Wei. Now, a direct translation from Chinese of these two words, Wu Wei, actually means doing nothing. And according to the beliefs of Daoism, we should all learn the concept of Wu Wei. It is actually key to our own actualization. Now, you might be at this point thinking, so you're saying, Melvin, doing nothing will bring me greatness. No, this isn't a philosophical excuse for laziness, but rather it is the philosophy of Daoism. We need to recognize the truth of nature. The idea of Wu Wei is actually to realize the arrogance that we have in our very egocentric selves, that we think we can somehow mold all of nature to our willful design. But in actuality, nature and life itself is much greater than that. To achieve any greatness, we need to recognize that there are greater forces at work in the very flow of life itself. And rather than trying to guide this flow of life, we actually give in fully to it. And perhaps by doing so, we can actually achieve much more and actualize ourselves much more than if we were to fight against it and egoistically believe that we can somehow mold it. Now, this sounds very abstract, but in Taoism, especially Dao De Jing, is a very paradoxical text. The key point being that rather than fight nature, we embrace it, recognize it, and give in to it. And this, of course, is in a great juxtaposition to most of Western thought in this regard. Dao De Jing would present a lot of very interesting analogies, but for example, being like water, in a way submissive to the flows of things, but yet at the same time, it can also be a force of great power because it ebbs in the flow of things, but because it ebbs in the flow of things, it has such great strength, capable of such great force. Now, before some of you think I'm trying to present a primer to be a very great martial artist, we can actually get a better breakdown of the concept of Wu Wei. If we look at the art of the Tang Dynasty. During the Tang Dynasty, a lot of the artists, the great artists, they were heavily inspired by the philosophy of Wu Wei. And some of the great artists actually explained in very great detail what Wu Wei is and how it actually worked in practice. According to some of them, for example, Zhang Zhao, embracing Wu Wei is very much like being drunk. Now, I'm not trying to say that we have a justification from the Chinese and the Chinese philosophy that we should all be alcoholics. But the point being that embracing Wu Wei is very much like the sense of when you're intoxicated and you have already dropped the rigidity and the structures of your usual self, and you're very much in the moment. Now, for those of you who have been intoxicated in your life before, who've been drunk or tipsy, you know exactly the feeling. It's when you are in very much, in every sense of the word, present with the moment. You're no longer having these pretensions. You're no longer in your mind, constantly analyzing every moment. You are accepting and embracing a moment and actually living in that moment. And according to the artists of the Tang Dynasty, that is when you can actually achieve great work. When you have put away all this ego and this sense of willful action and just being in the moment. And Zhang Zhao created a lot of these great masterpieces of nature. And if you have a chance, do actually search it up. Beautiful paintings that he's done. And according to him, what made it different was not that he was willfully trying to paint, let's say, natural scenery and make it one-to-one in terms of what he saw, which would be incredibly boring. But rather, he gave in to nature when he was actually sitting by a river, by a stream. Rather than trying to paint this great piece, he looked at the entire scene and actually embraced the beauty and the force of everything, letting everything inspire him as he naturally started to paint this inspiration that he felt, with no desires necessarily to create every stroke, but rather a natural inspiration and flow, which he allowed to be expressed onto the silk and the paper itself. And because of it, his painting is of course very, very different from all the other ones that we've seen in Chinese history. And that very much ties the idea of Wu Wei. Central to this premise is that in many of the major activities of life itself, the key isn't so much to exert this immense amount of effort or will and believe that somehow by doing so you could actually create greatness, but rather to realize the importance of actually stepping back and opening yourself to the flow of life itself. Rather than try and fight it, change it, we learn instead to be perceptive, to embrace it fully, and then learning to be adaptive and reactive to it. These ideas are very central to Eastern thought, specifically the philosophies of Taoism, but as we can also see in a very practical sense, have led to the success of great people like Aldous Huxley, specifically composed into this concept of law of reverse effort. And I find that to be so fascinating because constantly we think in life that for us to really achieve anything, we've got to do. But sometimes not doing is actually the way to go. We can certainly think back to the times when we try to sleep. The more we try to will ourselves to sleep, we just can't. But when we let our minds wander and actually give into the moment, that's when we finally rest. And the same things, when we think about the things we've done in life, some of the greatest moments and the greatest works that we've done in our own capacity have been moments when we've gone into this sense of flow. And that sense of flow is indeed something that has been discovered by great people like Huxley, but also by Taoist philosophers thousands of years ago. And I suppose that is the greatest paradox of life. There are many moments in life where the more you try hard to do something, the greater chances you make it worse. So perhaps it's time to step away from what you're doing and embrace Wu Wei.